Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As you know, my name is Rob Whittle. I'm the managing partner at Taxation LLC in the US, and this is the 8th of the webinars we've done, in effect, for businesses coming to the US to try and understand what I call fundamental differences between the UK and the US. Today's topic is talking about US retirement plans. And I was going to say, it gives me great pleasure to have Jason Ice here from C&P Wealth Management. Jason actually helps us with our retirement plan and helps various clients of ours with the retirement plan. He specializes in retirement plans for both businesses and individuals and has over 16 years of experience in this area in the US and is a very knowledgeable gentleman on this topic. As I think everybody who's been on these webinars before knows, that if you have any questions, if you want to type them into the box, that you have the ability, we will then answer them at the end of the presentation. As per normal, Jason and I will chat for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll then take questions. And if we don't have a chance to get through all the questions, then we will follow up with you afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jason Ice, who will talk and lead us through the fundamentals of US retirement plans.
Thank you, Rob. I think I'm the only one on the phone with an accent. You guys all don't have one. I have the accent, so I wish I sounded a lot cooler like you, but hey, it is what it is. The first thing, again, thank you for the time this morning, actually morning for us, afternoon for you, is I always joke is with the war of American aggression that happened years ago, there's certain things we didn't adopt from the UK. And the first thing is, every person I've talked to from the UK who's looking to at least look into a 401k or a retirement plan, they always call it a scheme. And maybe in the UK that comes across well because I had to research this. This is in the UK, they actually use it more of a noun. In the US, we actually use it as a verb, and it's typically not a good connotation for a lot of us. So first thing, because this is kind of, it's a paradigm shift for a lot of people, is we don't call it a scheme in the U.S. simply because it doesn't have a good definition here in the U.S. We call it a plan. So subtle difference, but when you're talking to U.S.-based employees, it actually has a big difference, a plan versus a scheme. So just high level, just want to kind of point that out. Next thing is, and I'm not here to educate you on the UK pension scheme, but high level is in the UK, for the most part, all employees are automatically enrolled into some type of scheme. It'll kind of vary on, the type of employee, when they were hired, etc. And then for the most part, all employers are required to set up some type of pension for employees. So in the UK, it's more forced on the employer. In the US, it's actually completely different. It's a voluntary decision by the employer. So the employer does not need, or it's not required to set up a plan. It's encouraged, but there's no requirement to set up a plan. And then what's also different is the type of plan you actually set up in the US can vary. There's not a kind of a one shoe fits all. You have some discretion of what kind of plan makes the most sense. And that's where I think Rob and I work the best together, is not to say, hey, here's what you have to do. Is, hey, let's have a conversation, let's have a conversation and come out with a good decision on the type of plan and the nuances of that plan that make the most sense. So US, you have more choice flexibility. UK, it's kind of already given to you. So that's really another difference you see in the US versus UK.
But I think the other thing we were chatting about earlier, Jason, was the fact is, as we do with a lot of these things that we do, is there's sort of just cultural differences as well. Is I still believe that from a UK perspective, there's still a cultural expectation from the employee that the employer is there to take care of them both when they're working and also when they retire. And that's sort of reflected from what we're talking about here, the legislation with the auto-enrollment, that all employers are required now at a certain staging date to set up a plan in the UK for the employees, whereas here in the US, I think the culture is still more along the lines is that the employee still believes it's more their responsibility to prepare for retirement. And if the employer also contributes some in, that's a nice benefit. But what employees really want is they want the ability to have a plan in place so they can save for their retirement.
Yeah, because what you saw was historically, most companies offered a pension where employees automatically got, in the US, employees automatically got a certain percentage saved for them. So really the employer took care of most of it. That changed about 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we introduced what's called a 401k. A 401k is just actually a section of the tax code. That's where they get the name from. When they introduced that 401k in the US, they shifted the responsibility and also, as Rob said, the expectation from the employer to more the employee, where the employer might give some money or typically does give something to employees, but the responsibility in the US has really shifted to where it's the employee's responsibility to save for retirement and make the various decisions. But it happened about 30 years ago. We saw that shift where it used to be 100% of people had a pension plan. Now it's about 20% of people in the US, and this number is consistently going down too. Only about 20% of employees in the US have a traditional pension scheme, UK-like pension scheme. It's more it's transformed to that 401k, and we'll discuss what a 401k is.
So in effect, from a UK perspective, we've gone from what we would term in the UK as a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. And correct. The 401k is the equivalent in the UK of a defined contribution plan.
Correct, and it's actually defined as a defined contribution. Absolutely, yep. So kind of high level, I wanted to walk through kind of the base plans because think of it as you're going to crawl before you walk before you run. So the main plans I'm really going to focus on the left-hand side is the SEP IRA, the Simple IRA, and what's called a 401k profit sharing. And whether you're for-profit or non-profit, all of these can work. On the right-hand side, you'll see a 403b. That's typically designed for a non-profit. So we're really going to focus on those. Know that, because you might see this or hear this, there are other types of plans out there, but typically you wouldn't be doing these type of plans until you've exhausted the first three, or you're looking to add upon or complement those three. So you'll hear about deferred compensation or cash balance or that defined pension plan. It's still around. But for the most part, when you're looking at a startup plan, the SEP IRA, the Simple IRA, the 401k should be your first choices. And then we might modify, adjust, or graduate to something else that can complement one of those three plans.
Now, obviously we're talking about, we've got owner-managed businesses from the UK who are setting up a subsidiary in the States, and more often than not, there might be key management coming from the UK to the US, or it's employees in the US. In that reality, when you're talking here about the advanced things like deferred compensation, cash balance plan, that they tend to come into play a little bit more. I think maybe deferred compensation with the big multinationals, and the cash balance plan is, we see here very much as if it was an owner-managed business here in the US. You can sometimes do a cash balance plan where you can put a lot more away for certain people within the company, maybe more often owners and that sort of thing.
The deferred compensation is typically designed for executives. It's an extra benefit to recruit, retain, reward executives. The cash balance would be where an owner a lot of times is looking to put away $50,000, $100,000+ away a year. So it can be good. It's just not something you typically start with. It's something you might graduate to at some point in time.
So in reality, as we're going through here, as you said, we're going to focus on the top three on the left-hand side, because we believe that those are going to be, in effect, the ones that if anybody who's on the call is thinking about setting up, those would be one of those three that they would look to set up.
Correct. The conversations I've had in the past, it's really one of these three, and they're all a little bit different. They all have different nuances. We're going to discuss those, but those are really the three to choose upon. The bottom ones, you really wouldn't start there. You might end up there, but you just wouldn't start there. So quick kind of high level in the US, if you look at the left-hand side, employee contributions. So when employee, and we'll walk through how much they can put away, but typically an employee, when they put money into a retirement plan, gets a tax deduction. Typically, no one here in the U.S. likes to pay taxes, so as much as we can look to reduce taxes, we like to do that. So any money an employee puts in, they're getting a tax deduction. That amount can vary, but kind of in your head, think about 25%.
So just when you talk about employee contributions here, is in the UK, which has changed now. It used to very much that you would put your employee contribution in net of tax, and then the government would give you tax relief back in your plan. In the UK now, a lot of employees go to a salary sacrifice, which basically means you elect for so much of your pay to be put into your contribution. So it's a gross contribution. The US works on a gross contribution basis, where when you put your money in, it reduces the amount of pay that you take home at the end of the month, and it's a gross contribution. So you get tax relief, in effect, is at source, as opposed to the government giving you back at a later date.
Yep, so it's an immediate tax deduction to employees. They see that immediately their paycheck is net of any savings that they're making.
Yeah.
The employer has some options. We'll walk through these. One is called a match, one's called a profit sharing. If they make that contribution, whatever amount they make, the employer would receive a tax deduction, an immediate tax deduction on that money. The amount will vary based upon income rates, etc. Both, whether it's the employee or employer, that account will grow tax deferred. So what that means is I put in $10,000, let's say it's now worth $50,000, that $40,000 worth of growth, as it grows, I do not realize any taxes on it. It's tax deferred, so I'm not paying taxes. I will pay taxes down the road. That's the next one, is account distributions. Typically, when I withdraw the money, so say example, I put in 50 grand, that 50 grand now is worth $200,000. When I start withdrawing from that, say I take out 20,000, that $20,000 is fully taxable at ordinary income tax rates when I do withdraw it. So just the amount I withdraw.
Now, the one big difference I think here in the UK and the US is in the UK, when you get to the stage when you can draw out your pension, you are allowed under UK law to take out 25% tax-free. Just so everybody's aware, in the US, there is no such rule. As soon as you start drawing down, that's taxable income to you.
Yeah, any amount that you take out is going to be taxable. And then they do have an age restriction. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, if an employee looks to take out their money or the employer money before age 59 and a half, there is a potential 10% penalty tax above and beyond the ordinary income taxes. There are ways around it. We work with people on that, but you'll see that where, hey, I'm having problems. I need money. I have no other way to access accounts. You will see people take an early distribution. The downside is always going to be taxable, but you could have a 10% penalty as well.
But just so everyone on the call is aware, that penalty is an employee penalty, not an employer penalty.
Correct. Yep. It's an individual employee penalty if they choose to take out their money. Yep. So we'll talk about this today, but there is no one plan that's right for every employer. It's really going to depend on multiple factors. How many current, and then really talk about your U.S.-based employees. So how many current employees? How many future? So if you're looking to really expand the next year or so, it's good to know that going in ahead. Because if we know the answers, or at least have a good idea, we can make a more educated decision on the type of plan and then the plan logistics. Do you own other common entities? Meaning is UK based, but they own 3 different companies in the US. There are some certain rules we have to be aware of based upon ownership percentages. Do we want to make employer contributions? They can be required or discretionary. Required means you have to make it regardless. Discretionary meaning is the employer makes the decision each and every year if they want to put money into the plan. How much are employees and or owners or executives looking to save? Because these have different ceilings of how much people can save. We'll walk through the nuances. Are there going to be what's called highly compensated employees? We have a slide to discuss this, but these are individuals or employees who make more than $120,000 a year. Last couple ones is vesting. So in the U.S., when the employer provides contributions, they don't have to be. Sometimes they are. They don't have to be 100% vested. Meaning is when the employer puts the money in, the employee gets it immediately, or it might take a number of years before the employee fully receives that money. There are various costs and fees to the employer, so we'll discuss that. There's also some compliance and administration that will vary between the plans. Then lastly is, depending on the plan that's selected, there are fiduciary responsibilities where someone is going to be required and has to adhere to the fiduciary laws here in the U.S., which do include personal liability, so something to always be aware of. Our job is to put protections in place. So there's, again, I don't want to ever say there's one plan that makes the most sense. It's really a collaborative conversation and decision between the accountant, between the advisor, between the employer, of what plan makes the most sense. So the first plan I was going to start with is what's called a Simplified Employee Pension IRA. I don't like the word pension in here, but it's part of the word. Referred to as a SEP IRA.
So Jason, what the IRA, what does IRA stand for?
Good question. IRA stands for Individual Retirement Account. So a SEP IRA is more designed for the employee. It's not a group plan where, think of it like an umbrella. Everyone's under one umbrella with a 401k, and we'll discuss that. On an IRA, each person will have their own individual account versus having a group account. So that's one of the differences there.
So really, your IRA would be equivalent in the UK of what we just call your own personal pension plan. So as you talk through this, any contributions that go into that sort of go. So if you had 20 employees, as you put on here, is you would have to make, in effect, 20 contributions to 20 different IRAs?
Correct.
Because that IRA belongs to the individual, and if they left, I assume then they are able to take it.
Correct. Once they leave, they can choose to do whatever they want with the account. So typically I see this for companies 20 employees or fewer, or a lot of times 5 and fewer. But there is no hard rule that, okay, you have to do this if you have under 5 people. I see this typically when it's a husband, wife, or a single person owner with very few employees. Here's why. The SEP IRA is funded entirely by the employer. So employees are not eligible to put money into this plan. So the employer would pick us, if they're going to make a contribution, the contribution is discretionary. They would choose, hey, do I want to make a contribution? Let's say the answer is yes. If so, whatever contributions given the percentage, for example, I'm going to give 5%, every employee must get 5%. So you can't skew it. Oh, I'm an owner, I get more. Well, you might get dollar-wise more because it's a percentage, but everyone has to get the same percentage. And so it's easy to set up, it's easy to administer, but not many employers are looking to have to give the same percentage to all employees. So it can work, but typically it's where it's a 1, 2, maybe 5 person company. So on a SEP IRA, again, all eligible employees, and eligible means typically you have the choice. It's where someone has worked for you for at least 3 months, and you can actually go up to 3 years. This is an employer decision. You can make that window as narrow or as wide as possible. So all employees, eligible employees, are going to receive the same percentage of compensation. You can't offer, remember I said, hey, there's some base plans, then there's some more advanced plans. The SEP can be the only plan that you offer. You can't offer the SEP and another plan. This can be your only offered plan. If you want to move from a SEP, for example, to another plan, you can only do that one time a year. You can only change it on January 1st. So it's a little difficult sometimes to graduate from a SEP IRA to something else. It's possible. There's just some limitations we have to play with it.
So from a practical point of view, if you set up a SEP IRA to start with and then decided you wanted to go into one of the other plans we're going to talk about, because you can only change it once a year, in reality, from a timing perspective, it's most probably something you want to start shutting down, I imagine, September, October.
Correct.
To make sure that you've got all the paperwork in place to make sure it's shut down by December 31st, so you can start your new plan on January the 1st.
Correct, because the SEP, as the next point shows, it's easy to set up because we can set up typically within 1 to 2 weeks. But if we want to transition to another type of account, typically it's going to be will require more paperwork. That could take 45 to 60 days. And sometimes there's some notices that actually push it back another 30 days. So this is a conversation, as Rob said, typically September, October. We want to have the conversation and probably by mid-October make a decision to make a change so we can adhere to that January 1st deadline. And then as Rob has pointed out, is each employee has their own account. So as an employer, you would be sending money, your portion, to probably 20 different accounts, depending on how many there are. So this works typically for a smaller company. It loses its advantages as the company gathers more employees. Contribution limits, so the employer can, not saying they have to do this, they can put typically up to 25% of employees' compensation. Remember, whatever percentage they give, they have to give the same percentage to everybody. They can go up to 25%, but there is a hard cap of $54,000. It is $60,000 if the employee is age 50 or older. So again, $54,000. Vesting. Any money, remember, this is employer funded only. It's 100% immediate, meaning once the employer puts the money in the employee's account, it's the employee's account. It's their money. If they leave the next week, next month, next year, the money stays with them. There's very little required compliance and administration. Really what there is a one-page plan document that says, hey, employees are eligible after 3 months or 6 months or a year. We're going to exclude certain employees, but there's very little compliance and administration. That's why it takes about 1 to 2 weeks to set up. And because of that, there's low fiduciary responsibilities. You're not adhering to various compliance rules. There's very little to do other than set up the account. And then if you're going to fund it, make sure you fund the same percentage for everybody. Besides that, there's really not a lot of other work by the employer. So it's easy to set up. It's only employer funded, and that's where a lot of times this doesn't work for a lot of companies because employees typically like to put money in as well.
So when we talk about this, an employer funded pension is when, if you decide to, so say, let's take an example, we've got a December year end, December of 17, and I'm assuming with these sort of things, it's more than likely you'll see how the year goes. You'll then decide what your percentage is because that doesn't have to be the same each year. It just has to be the same across the board for that year.
Correct.
Is when do you have to fund it to get your tax deduction on your December 2017 return?
Good. The nice flexibility of a SEP is you have up until your tax filing deadline to fund the SEP IRA. So let's just say my tax filing deadline is March 15th or April 15th of 2018 for 2017. You can wait all the way till April 15th of 18 to fund 2017. And then if an employer does an extension, which is pretty common, you have all the way up until the extension to create the plan and fund the plan. So this gives you the most flexibility of setting it up and funding it. You could literally do it, I wouldn't wait to the last day, but within a week or 2 weeks of your filing deadline, you could set up the plan and fund the plan. As Rob said, the amount you put in each year can be dictated by business results. So you might give 5% one year, 0% the next year, 2%. It just has to be the same across the board if you are going to give one. So now I'm flipping over to a different type of plan. It's called a simple IRA plan. Simple stands for Savings Incentive Match Plan for Employees. That's the last time you'll see me spell it out because simple is just a lot easier to say. So the simple, there is a hard number rule for 100 or fewer employees. So you can't have more than 100 employees in a simple IRA plan. This is funded by employees and employers. So this gives employees the ability to save into the plan. Okay. Employee eligibility. It can be immediate, meaning if you hire me today, I can immediately start saving into it, or you could have it go up to 2 years. Typically, we see it in the immediate or maybe up to about 6 months of service when employees can become eligible for it. This is offered to all employees who received at least $5,000 or expected to receive $5,000 in compensation. So we started with the SEP. We're transitioning to, this is more common I see for startups. This is kind of, I would say option A for startups is what's called a simple IRA plan. Employees, so this is a big difference from the SEP. Employees can, they don't have to, they can save up to $12,500 a year into the plan. If they're age 50 or older, they can save a little bit more into it. Any money they put in is pre-tax. The employer, where before they had a discretionary decision, employers have two options. They can either make a 2% non-elective, which means all employees, regardless if they contribute, receive 2%. Or option two, 3% elective, which means they get 3% only if they put at least 3% into the plan. Simple IRA, similar to the SEP, there's very little cost and fees. It's easy to set up. Vesting, the employees always vested in their money, just like the SEP. There's very little required compliance administration. Fiduciary responsibility, the only key thing is if employees are putting money into it, make sure you're transmitting the employee deferrals within a timely period. I've seen some employers hold the money for a period of time, meaning a month. We want to do that really as soon as administratively possible. Simple IRA has the same kind of year-end requirement like the SEP. It can only be done on January 1st if you want to move from a simple IRA to another plan. It can be the only plan that you offer within the year. Setting up a plan, a little bit more than a SEP because there's some requirements we have to adhere to. Each employee is going to open up their own account, 10 to 30 days roughly to set up a plan. We just have a goofy timeline on a simple that if you don't set up by October 1 of the current year, you have to wait to the following year to set it up. So right now, we can't set up a simple IRA until January 1st of 2018. And I know I'm breezing through a couple of these, but you have the slides, and that's really I just want to touch upon some, just so you kind of know what's going on.
Just going back to the simple IRA, from a fiduciary perspective, what sort of responsibilities does the employer have on that?
Yeah.
And also, as you and I know, and you've spoken to some of our clients, Jason, is we have clients that maybe have employees in various states. So unlike maybe a traditional US business where they might have everybody in one state, how does the simple IRA work if you've got somebody in Washington, somebody in North Carolina, somebody in Ohio?
Yeah.
Are there any practical issues that we've got to think about or deal with to be able to put it in place?
Gotcha. On the fiduciary side, really it's making sure that the proper employees are eligible, making sure they're aware of the plan. If they want to save, transmitting the deferrals. Besides that, there's not a lot of other fiduciary responsibilities. As Rob said, is if you have, for example, one employee per state, each employee has to set up their own account. And where that gets kind of tough is as an advisor, I need to be licensed in each state that an employee is in. Whereas the 401k or a different type of plan, I'm getting to the 401k, I just have to be licensed in the state that the company is really based out of. So there's some logistics that come into play when you have multiple states and maybe one or two employees. Because on the advisor side, I have to pay fees per state. Like if there's not a uniform, I'm not licensed in all 50 states. I have to be licensed per state. And then there's rules and filing fees I have to adhere to. So it's just, there's stuff to work out where that's one of the filters where we decide which plan makes the most sense.
From a fiduciary perspective, who can, because this becomes a thing for the SEP IRA, the simple IRA, and the 401k, who can or who cannot be the fiduciary?
Typically for these plans is you need to have someone in the U.S. who can sign documents. And this is a U.S. law, is we need ideally have head of sales, key employee, an owner who's residing in the U.S. be able to sign documents. If they can't, or that just doesn't apply to your company, we can come up with some ideas on that. So it could be something, it's a workaround. There's just some more thinking we have to do where we might need to nominate a third party to do so.
The thing in some of these situations is that where we've got clients coming over here, the finance person who would normally have access to all this information is maybe staying in the UK. And I think a lot of employers may not want their head of sales knowing what's necessarily going to that. So it seems like in that situation, the workaround thing is you'd have to pay and incur the cost of getting a third-party fiduciary who would take on that responsibility for a fee. But by doing that, it would mean that your employees over here, or the employee that you're going to put in charge, wouldn't know what's going on, so you'd be able to keep it confidential. And if it's not somebody who's in finance.
Correct. Yeah, that's an unintended consequence. Is they could see the payroll for everybody. So that third party, we could find a person. We work around that. Typically a cost of maybe $500 a year. Really what we're doing is we're buying a fiduciary insurance policy on that third party. But we can make it work. And it's part of the conversation piece. 401k. So this is, I'd say, is by far the most common plan type for U.S.-based companies, but it doesn't have to be where you start. This is available to all companies regardless of your number of employees. Could be a one person, could be a 10,000 person plan. We can select eligibility. So the 401k has more moving pieces. So this is really where we make decisions on when employees are eligible, when can they save. So we can select when they're eligible. We can also exclude certain employees, for example, leased employees or union employees. There's different employees we can exclude.
But I think when you talk about the exclusion there, very much like what we've had a presentation on healthcare before, you have to be very careful of discrimination rules. So you can work through it, but I would imagine from a practical perspective, where we've got a client from the UK coming to the US and they've maybe got anywhere from 5 to 10 employees, to do all those extra pieces, you're most just going to say whatever you do for one employee, you do for the other employees.
Yeah,
practically.
401k is going to have the highest compliance regulations. So this is where we need to have a good meeting ahead of time. But correct, there are certain discrimination laws. There's about 7 different ones we have to be aware of. We can work around them, but there are some hard rules of the sandbox that we can't get around. Again, I'll cover a couple of these later on. Nice thing of a 401k is employees can save the most into it. They can save up to $18,500 away a year. If they're age 50 or older, that number bumps up to $24,500. Subject to discrimination, I'm going to cover that. Any money the employee puts in, they're always 100% vested in that, meaning it's their money. Employees can choose. I'm not going to go deep in the Roth, but they can choose either to do pre-tax or what's called a Roth. High level on a Roth, I do not get a tax deduction now, but when I pull out the money after age 59 and a half, I don't pay taxes on the growth. It's more applicable generally for younger employees, but something we'd cover a different time. The employer can offer a match. So in a simple, they only had one of 2 options. For a 401k, you can make a decision, hey, I want to offer a match, but I'm going to keep it discretion, meaning each year, depending on how the company does, I'll decide what the match will be. I can make it elective, where you have to put money in to get the match, or I can make it non-elective, where everyone gets a contribution regardless if they contribute. This is also different on a 401k. So when the employer puts money into the plan, okay, the employee does not immediately vest, meaning it could take them up to 6 years. It could be immediately, that's your decision, or up to 6 years for them to vest in the employer money, okay? So let's say I've worked for a company for 3 years. At 3-year mark, if I leave, I get to keep 50%, but the remaining 50% actually would come back to the plan, not the company, but the plan. And that 50%, let's just say it's $3,000, that $3,000 could be used to offset future contributions, or B, to offset fees. And that kind of goes into my next topic of cost and fees. The 401k, because of the more compliance regulations, it has higher fees. Typically, year 1 will be the highest fee because there's startup work needed. We need to create what's called a plan document. Year 1, it's generally in the range of $4,000 to $7,000. The difference there will depend upon the number of employees. Year 2, that fee typically drops down a little bit, but still you're going to have this ongoing fee regardless. The employer, the other costs and fees, if you do an employer match, if you do a profit sharing, I'll talk about a profit sharing, that's an additional fee. Then lastly, just fiduciary responsibilities. This has the highest fiduciary responsibilities. My job is to help you reduce any liability, but you're still going to have them there. Because 401ks are subject to ERISA. ERISA was passed in the early 70s. It really created the 401k. stringent fiduciary compliance requirements. And this is true whether you're a one-person plan or a 10,000-person plan, you're subject to the same rules. There is no small plan exclusion. As Rob said before, there's some non-discrimination rules we have to follow. And then there is an annual Form 5500. It's a tax document that would need to be filed every year. Typically what happens, your administration company would prepare it for you, but the fiduciary, that person in charge, would need to file it once a year.
So just going back up one thing, I'll ask you a question. So with your fiduciary responsibilities, there are a lot more here. So what, maybe you can talk people through, because I'm not sure we're on other slides, but what happens if an employee leaves? And from a fiduciary perspective, are they required to leave their monies with you, have to take them? Do you have to change the investments? What's the process when somebody leaves with money? Because obviously, as a company, you don't want to take on excess liability if you can help it.
Yep, so going back to fees. The fees are typically based on your number of employees. So if you have a terminated employee, if they have under $5,000 in the account, you're able to actually move them to an IRA, individual retirement account. And this is generally recommended because by moving them out, you're not paying the fee for that participant. If they have more than $5,000 in the account, they're required, you cannot actually kick them out of the plan. You can encourage them, but you can't kick them out. But by moving them out of the plan, it does reduce A, fees, but B, fiduciary responsibility. Because there's certain notices that have to go to those employees each year. It does reduce some of your responsibility by moving them out of the plan. And it's generally just the right thing to do because it's going to save the company money.
Now, if in a sense they decide not to leave the plan, and when we talk about a plan, what we're doing from the equivalent from a UK perspective is I put $10,000 into my pension plan in a year. Within the 401k, that 401k mostly has 10 mutual fund, 10 unit trust funds. Yep. That I can split that contribution up into, and they can obviously be varying risk based on my age profile. If they leave and they've got everything in a highly volatile fund there, and they put 100% in the most volatile fund, obviously that's risky for us there. Are we, even if we have to leave them in there, do we have an ability to convert it over into the least risky fund so that in effect is it one protects us and two might encourage them to leave?
Yep. So in the U.S., because it's their money, you can't force them to move to a more conservative fund, but we can put layers of protection that shield the employer from bad investment decisions by the employee. There are what's called a 404C protection. I'm not going to go into it, but as long as you adhere to that, you're not liable for their bad decisions. We can also default them into what's called a target date fund based upon their age. There are some workarounds on that, and that's where it's not a 401k is not something you set up and then forget about. It's something that every 6, 8, 10 months we're looking at and maybe tweaking if it makes the most sense. Because what makes sense today might need some adjusting 1, 2, 3 years from now. And that kind of leads us into, on a 401k, this is the major downside of a 401k, is that you have compliance testing. And the one that hits most people is called this average deferral percentage test. And think of it, you have two buckets of people. I'm an employee, I make less than $120,000. I'm an employee that makes more than $120,000. Now, if all your employees are under $120,000, this test is not applicable to you. But if you have an executive or you might have somebody who's making more than that, this will come into play. And this kind of shows what happens is the ADP test only affects your highly compensated. Remember, these are people, any owners or employees making more than $120,000. Your non-highly, so your rank and file, are not affected by this test. So if you look example A, if the average, so if I have 10 people and they're all putting away, 0%, 1%, 2%, the average is 1%, that means my highlies can only put away 2% more. So they could have an amount returned to them. So what happens is it could reduce the amount that goes back to the highly compensated. So high level here, I don't want to walk through great detail, but this is something, it's part of that design. As we're looking to design a plan, we want to be aware of this ADP test because it could hurt your executives. And a possible solution is what's called a safe harbor election. This allows us to remove this test, but if we want to remove it, we have to do some type of employer match. Could be elective, could be non-elective. So this is a solution to fix a failed ADP test, and we would know if you're going to fail the test early on. Again, this is why it's a continuous work with the accountant and the advisor. Profit sharing. This is probably one of the nicest things you have with a 401k. So on top of the employee putting money in, on top of having the employer match, a profit sharing. This is where the employer can make a discretionary decision up until their tax filing deadline if they want to make a contribution. If they want to make a contribution, then they can. For example, I want to put $50,000, $70,000 in. You don't have to do a profit sharing, but there are benefits. One, it's a tax deduction, but it's also a way to reward employees, because that's in the 401k in the U.S. The 401k is a way to reward, recruit, and retain employees. The profit sharing is a way to reward employees if maybe there's a very good business year, and it could be done one year. The following year you may not do it.
And once again, with the profit sharing contribution, as long as you fund that by the time you file your tax return the following year, that's fine. So it's pretty good from a cash flow perspective.
Correct. Yep. And it's a discretionary decision. So you can run the numbers. Hey, I think I want to make one, but after running the numbers, you may decide, you know what, I don't want to. So it can be done after the year. This is where, again, I say keying in the account. It's a proactive conversation with the accountant, because it is a tax play as well. It is a tax deduction to the employer, but you have to have the cash flow as well to do so. So designing a 401k, it's part art, it's part science, because there's pros, there's cons, but there's also unintended consequences. So it's a team effort to design and select the right type of plan, but realize the plan you select in the beginning might not be the plan you're in 3 or 4 years from now, or it might change or evolve, and that's okay. That's where our job is to give you advice, to let you know, hey, here's what you need to know. Here are the things you don't really need to know. That's where I work a lot with Rob is, hey, what's the most important things? What do you need to know? Because we can talk about what employees should be eligible, what's their time frame, do we do a match, do we do a profit sharing? There's a lot of moving pieces, and it can really mean the difference of retaining or even hiring, recruiting a key executive to your company, because they're looking for this. They're looking to see, do you have a retirement plan? If so, do you make matching contributions? Do you make a profit share?
Just a timely thing here. We've had one question come in talking about matching and employee contribution. What the question basically is, what do you see as a typical 401k match from an employee? Because the thing we've talked about is I always have to, very often with the clients we deal with in the UK, because of the culture in the UK, have to stop the clients from the UK coming to you and being too generous because they're looking at it from a UK perspective. But what do we normally see in the US as a value, as a match percentage or amount?
Typically, we see about 3%. And that's generally where an employee has to put a certain amount into the plan, meaning 6%. A lot of times we see 50% up to 6%. So what that means is if I'm the employee, I need to put away 6% for the employer to give me 3%. And I generally recommend a lot of times make the employee put in more to get the match, because one, it's forcing them to save, which in the end is a good thing for them. But for most plans, we see about a 3% match. It'll vary based on industry, and we have different numbers that based on your industry, what's an average. And I can kind of compare you and benchmark you versus other companies in your industry, but about 3% is a typical match for most companies.
So to give an example there, so if an employee was earning 100,000 and they decided to put away 10% of their salary, in effect is that would be 10,000. The employer would put away 3,000.
Correct.
And then to add into that from a play, because I suppose you want to do it as an employer as a reward, as a recruitment tool, as a retention tool, is you would also factor into that potentially a vesting schedule as well. So that 3,000 would either vest on a cliff basis, my understanding. So at the end of 3 years, they're vested in fully, or they could split it out as long as 6 years, but then they'd have to do a certain amount each year. So that might be 20, 40, 60, 80.
Yeah.
So in effect, is even though you're giving it now, the company's getting a tax deduction, they actually potentially don't get the benefit unless they stay with you and perform.
And this is very common in the U.S. to really tie that really is you want a lot of these employees long term, so it's a way to tie them to your company. But so somewhere between 0 to 6 years, it will become the employee's money, and any amount they forfeit when they, if and when they leave, would come back to the plan, and then the company can use that to offset future contributions or plan costs/fees. So other things, when we're designing a 401k, do we make the safe harbor election? What type of profit sharing? Do we automatically enroll employees in? So there's many decisions. This is where I come in to help educate and advise companies, hey, here's what I think you should do, but here's also the pros and the cons and the unintended consequence if you do this. Because I love to say that it's one shoe fits all. It just isn't. I don't think there's one solution that's right for every company. So I think it's a conversation. This is really just, again, comparing the plans. The SEP, the simple, 401k/403b is roughly the same. One is just for profit, one is for nonprofit. But for the most part, the rules are about the same. So kind of next steps, have the conversation. Hey, is it advisable to set up a retirement plan? If I do want to set up a retirement plan, what type of plan is right for me? Then inside of that plan, what are the specifics that make the most sense for my company now? Again, might be something we change, but what makes the most sense now? And then that ongoing service and monitoring, that's the service part. That's where I come in. That's where Rob comes in. Hey, let's talk about, hey, what are changes we might make? And then what's the short-term or long-term consequences of making that.
So I think with that, Jason, thank you very much for that. That sort of brings us to any questions we have. And I've got to just going down. There's a few questions coming in, which I will try and summarize and put across to everybody. But in effect is, obviously we've talked about, and it's always put out there, the retirement plan being a hiring and a retention tool is, from your practical experience, what the question has basically been asked is, do you see all companies set up a pension plan? Some? When do they set it up? How big are they? How often do they use the benefit? Maybe you can give a little bit of insight with all the companies you deal with, how things happen.
It can vary, but if you're hiring U.S.-based employees, their second or third question is going to be, what type of retirement plan do you have? And that actually, it could be the triggering point for a lot of companies to set it up, is that they're starting to grow and they want to go get top tier talent. And to get the top tier talent, you have to offer something. And whether it's the simple IRA, the 401k, potentially the SEP, you need something in place. So generally sooner versus later, but you want to make sure that depending on the plan you choose, what are the costs and fees, something you can stomach today? Because they're there regardless if people are making contributions. Some of these fees you have to pay no matter what. So that's where, generally sooner versus later, getting into the weeds, it's going to be a company by company decision. But that's what I like about it. It's not that there's not just one thing makes the most sense. It's going to depend on your company and what you're looking to do, the employers you're looking to hire, where are those employees, etc.
Okay, that's a good point. So carrying on to, in effect, is where are those employees? Because quite often, once again, is with a lot of clients we deal with, they'll come to the US and they'll set a base up somewhere, and then they'll have another office somewhere else. So quite often, as you've seen with some of the clients you've worked with us on, they'll have employees all over the place. If that's the case, is there a better or worse plan to choose, or what sort of analysis do you go through there, both from a helping a cost benefit, what employees want, a management sort of perspective? Is there one particular way you go that, or particular plan if you've got employees all over the place?
A lot of times it's more based on what the employer is looking to provide, meaning is, do they want a match, or do they want a required match or a discretionary match? We can generally figure out the employees where they're located. It gets tougher sometimes when you have, call it 10 employees in 10 different states. So if there's more states versus fewer states, we typically like the 401k. If there's fewer states, I might lean more towards the simple IRA, but it also will come down to what cost and fees is the employer willing to absorb in the short term, but also long term.
Okay. Just going back to, I'm just going to pick up on something you mentioned a few minutes ago, is Obviously, we look at a pension when you're giving somebody a job offer. At some stage, they're going to ask about it. Now, I think you will know as well as I do, when we've gone through this, in reality, from a practical perspective, it might look that when you start up, a simple IRA might be the most cost efficient, least admin you've got to worry about, least fiduciary rights, which in reality, when we're dealing with clients in the UK, because it's a new system over here, they might go, well, that's great. That's what I want to do because it keeps my life simple. But you know as well as I do is over here, if you most probably put in your letter, you've got a simple IRA, people would maybe, even over here, would look at it and go, what's that?
Correct.
Whereas if it's a 401k, they go, oh, well, that's a pension, but I know that. So do you see, other than explaining, do you think that that would have any impact on people sometimes if you put that in as opposed to a 401k?
Yeah, most employees have no idea what a simple IRA is, even though it's been around for a number of years. If you say, well, we have a simple IRA, most employees will say, well, what's that? And then the most common answer is, it's similar to a 401k. And they're like, okay. So sometimes we go towards the 401k simply because the name notoriety of it is it helps. It's an additional value add to an employee because one, they can save more money into it versus the simple, it just doesn't have the name recognition in the US. Even though it's been around, it could be tougher to sell a key employee on a simple versus a 401k.
So the other thing that's interesting at the moment, and you can maybe comment on this, is obviously I think if anybody has been watching the news from the UK, it's even been on the UK news because I was there last week, and for once it's maybe something that's a little bit positive about Trump as opposed to negative, but there's potentially a big tax reform bill going on. One of the things that was being thrown out there in some of the earlier discussions was that employer pension contributions were no longer going to be deductible, which was going to be not good as far as I could see, because it would then, why would you, except as being a very benevolent employer, why would you want to make all those contributions if you get tax relief on them? Where do you see that going now? Do you see law staying the same, or do you see it going this way? What are your thoughts on tax reform with pensions at the moment?
I sat through many workshops with lobbyists from DC, and there was a lot of things kicked around. So we were kind of at that unknown part, but under the current, again, nothing's been passed in the US, but everything we've seen, there's really no changes to retirement plans. Almost all changes are affecting the individual participant or the employee. But on the 401k side, right now, there's no impact to contributions, deductions, phase outs. There's no downsides that are hitting companies, at least right now. Now, something could come in that we don't know about, but that's also why we have jobs, is to figure out when and if something comes down the pike, okay, how do we deal with it? What makes the most sense now?
Okay. I think just to wrap up, I've got one final question that I've got for you that wasn't sent in by attendees. And one is when we have clients coming from the UK to the US, obviously it's even though we speak the same language, it's a different system. And from a expansion perspective, the fewer people they can deal with, the better on certain things. So quite often, sometimes when they'll come to the States, with respect to health insurance, pensions, payroll, if they can find a provider that provides all those under one umbrella, that's quite appealing to them. Perhaps you wouldn't mind sharing the pros of that and the cons of that, to sort of maybe educate the people on the thing. Is it better to have everything under one umbrella, or have it with separate advisors? From your experience?
And I say there's, as Rob said, there's good and there's bad. Typically, I see, and I work with these companies, is you see like an ADP or a Paychex, the payroll providers, where they can also, in addition to doing payroll, they can do your 401k. And I actually have two plans with Paychex, so I know the product fairly well, because I can deal with about 20 or 30 different companies. The type of company, that's where my job is to kind of see what's the right fit. Here's what I've seen with an ADP Paychex. The good of it is exactly what Rob said. It's one-stop shopping. I have one number to call, and it might be a different number, but one company to call, and I can figure it out. Typically with Paychex, ADP, I see low fees. They can actually bundle a lot of the fees because they're already doing your payroll services. And technically, actually, Paychex actually has the most number of 401ks in the US. So they're a major provider. The bad I've seen, because I get into the weeds of these, is Paychex, ADP, they're good at payroll. 401k is not their specialty. So you're limited a lot of times in your plan document. If you have any one-offs or anything gets kind of goofy or different, they can't work with you. Secondly, is you get an 800 number. It's never a person. So each time you call, you have to explain who you are, and you're never going to talk to the same person. Those companies also have high turnover. So you're never going to talk to the same person. As I said before, is service is the biggest issue with them. And what I've seen, especially with those two companies, is no matter what your question is, the answer is 401k. They don't do simple IRAs. So their answer is always going to be a 401k when sometimes that's not the best plan for you. So it's kind of like, oh, you need a 401k. And I've seen clients, because as I said, Paycheck has the most 401ks, but they also have the smallest account balance across the industry. So they set up 401ks for everybody, and they kind of get you into it. And then setting it up is fairly easy, but it's all the service items that come with it. It can work. I typically prefer doing a company that's all they do is 401k or administration. So I can work with you no matter which one. Ideally, I've seen better success stripping it out and working with different companies.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for answering all those questions, Jason, and for filling us a lot of information. Hopefully, everybody's picked something up. But just as we come to the end of the hour, if there was just two things, if nothing else, that you hope that somebody could take away from here, what would be the two things that you hope they would take away from the presentation today?
Yeah, a retirement plan is important in the U.S. because it's not required. So by offering it, you're a value add. So view it as I call it the 4 R's: recruit, retain, reward, and retiring your employees. So it's a key benefit. And then secondly is if you're going to offer the benefit, let's have a good conversation on what type of plan and what plan specifics make the most sense. It should be a team effort. Where we have a couple conversations on what makes the most sense. So it's not just something, hey, let's do it. It's not ready, fire, aim. I say it's ready, aim, then fire. We'll come up with what makes the most sense, but let's have that good conversation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jason. That brings us to the end of this afternoon's webinar. But I would just like to let everybody know that obviously we're going to continue doing these, and depending on where the tax reform bill ends up and when the law gets passed, or if it gets passed, my thought process would be is if something happens in the next couple of weeks, that we'll do a webinar early in 2018 to bring everybody up to date on the tax changes that have happened that may impact your businesses here in the US. And subsequent to that, in May time, I'm looking to have a speaker come in who is very involved in tax legislation and that process in Washington, and we as a firm are a member of the Small Business Council of America, and have him come in and talk about what's actually going on in Washington and what's happening, to give you a live input on what may happen in the coming year from a tax legislation. So with that being said, we will wrap up to make sure everybody's off before the hour is up, but I would like to wish everybody very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a very happy and healthy New Year. And thank you for attending this morning.